I think what's undeniable is that a far larger number of people are going to work remotely full-time after the pandemic than did before. And if we want to throw some hard numbers at that, we go back to 2008, somewhere between 3.8 and 5 million people worked remotely in the US. Post-pandemic, the numbers are looking like it's going to be somewhere between 25 and 30 million people. And if they continue at the rate of growth, they'll hit somewhere around 80 million people globally by 2030. And obviously, the sort of implication of that is that the large organizations are going to be the ones most affected by that because they employ the most people. The examples of all the banks that we've been speaking about are interesting because their CEOs have basically came out and said, hey, we're going to do this. And I think the question I would always have on that is like, how much of that is protectionism of the real estate that they own and how much of it is sort of swimming against the current of time in terms of what people are actually going to demand. And I think if you look at the sort of outflux of people from those traditional sectors over the last 20 years towards tech, I think people will more than ever begin to optimize for the situations that they're happiest in.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Powers, and I want to thank you for joining me on the Fort Podcast today. This show is an open-ended discussion and journey covering real estate, business, entrepreneurship, and investing. I would love to hear from you by tweeting me at Fort Worth Chris on Twitter. And if you've enjoyed this show, I would be super grateful if you would subscribe on Apple or Spotify or whatever platform you're listening on. And if on Apple, if you would leave a rating and review, it would mean a lot. And last but not least, you can check out all these episodes on YouTube. Hey guys, it's Chris. Thank you so much for joining me today on The Fort. I have Chris Hurd, who is the founder of FirstbaseHQ.com, which is a business that helps businesses set up remotely. And I have a returning guest and friend of mine, Jonathan Wasserstrum, who is the founder of SquareFoot, which is a business that helps companies find office space. And we set this up as a cool opportunity to kind of hear two views of the world in how businesses are going to be kind of organizing themselves going forward, whether that be an office-centric business or more remote. We talk about the nuances in each. And again, two guys that are building successful companies. It was really cool to hear their viewpoints on the world. And I hope you enjoy this episode. Chris and Jonathan, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Good to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Can we just get started? Maybe Jonathan, you can go first, and then Chris on just a little bit about your backgrounds and what you're doing today.
Yeah. Thanks again. Welcome. I think this is going to be fun. So, Jonathan Wasserstrum, co-founder, CEO of SquareFoot. I've been in commercial real estate for about 15 years now. Started doing capital markets work at JLL during the global financial crisis, which was fun. So more on the finance side, and then started SquareFoot about a decade ago now. SquareFoot's essentially a tech-enabled commercial real estate brokerage. So we work with companies to help solve their real estate needs. And that's everything from the three of us who need a desk or a set of desks at WeWork all the way to Fortune 500 companies. And it's been a lot of fun. Last year of COVID where people were not allowed to go into the offices, notwithstanding.
Yeah. Chris?
Yeah, so I'm Chris Hurd. I'm the founder and CEO of Firstbase, HQ.com. And we help companies set up, support, and scale remote teams globally. We work with everything from early stage startups that I'm sure everyone's probably heard of, through to $50 billion publicly listed companies. The reason I got into remote work, I think, is kind of interesting. Never started out trying to build the business that we ended up creating. Started out building a financial technology company. Became remote because we thought it was the only way that we could hire, attract, and retain highly talented people. And on the other side, it was a personal sort of quality of life thing as well. I'd missed my daughter walking, laughing, and talking for the first time. So really wanted to be there to see her grow up, spend more time with my family. And what's probably apparent from my accent is I'm not from the US. And I wanted to live where I wanted to live, which was and is in Scotland in the United Kingdom. So like Jonathan, looking forward to this. Should be fun.
Yeah, no. So for listeners, we're going to just have a discussion on kind of remote work and the office and the pros and cons of each. Jonathan and Chris each come from kind of different backgrounds and see the world, differently. And so the hope is to kind of see both sides of things and get a better understanding of maybe where the world would be headed. So kind of the loaded question, I think there's a lot of discussion here. And Chris, you've kind of been vocal about, the way that we think about remote work in a COVID area is actually different than maybe what remote work looks like maybe in more normal times. So can each of you kind of, from your perspective, tell me what remote work is to you and maybe where it's done and just how you think about it?
Yeah, maybe I'll grab this one first. So I would start out by sort of expanding on what you've just alluded to there, which is the last 12 months have not been remote working. They've been pandemic enforced work from home, where people are basically enduring the worst possible version of remote working. There's been homeschooling and lockdowns, and I've been stuck in the UK. Haven't been able to see my wife's family for nearly 2 years. And basically just all the things that people love doing, being able to travel, being able to see friends, being able to eat in restaurants with people they care about, they haven't been able to do largely in the last 12 months. So that to me has not been remote work. And to define what it is in my mind, remote work is about empowering people to do the best work that they've ever done in their lives, irrespective of location. And that means if they do their best work at home, they can work there. If it means they do it in a coffee shop, they can work there. And equally, if it means they do that in an office, they can do it from there. And there's something that we can maybe expand on later, which I like to think about. There's only two types of companies. There's a lot of chat right now about hybrid organizations. I actually don't think they exist. I think there's remote first organizations and there's office first organizations. And how the company functions dictates that more than the location at which most or all or the majority of their people reside in.
Okay. Jonathan?
I don't know, man. So there's for me, there's office and there's work from home, and there's Starbucks is a third place. I guess a funny fact what the popular definition of remote might be, SquareFoot, an office leasing company, has been remote for about 5 years now. We have a team in Belfast, full-time, a team in Belfast for about 5 years now. By the way, they don't work from home. They work for an office because they like being together all the time. And not for nothing, we as a commercial real estate services firm provide services in a bunch of different markets, which means this COVID put a pause on it, but we now have offices in Houston and LA, and we just closed on a deal that got announced today, actually, in Atlanta and Nashville. So I guess we're a remote workforce, but we just all work in the office most of the time. I think one of the big changes from pre-COVID to now, actually not so much for us because we're already kind of decently flexible, is that more companies are going to be more flexible, right? So again, my least favorite, but also easiest examples to use are personal anecdotes. I lived in New York City for the last 10 years. My wife and I had our first kid. We moved to the suburbs during COVID, had both the kid and moved to the suburbs. So Mondays and Fridays, 95% of those, I'm actually working from home. And we, separate from me as CEO doing that, that's something that we as an organization are very comfortable with. But what we don't find a very good replication of is the in-office experience. So we try and have a lot of people in and around the office most of the time. And we already, like I said, have had to figure out what it means to be a distributed workforce, because for us, the best talent is also everywhere. We can't hire a broker in New York City and expect her to be able to close a real estate transaction in LA. So this was already kind of something that, and by the way, this is how a lot of companies have been operating forever. So I think the big thing that COVID kind of introduced to everybody is the fact that you can have a more flexible work environment than you used to have. And we'll see what most companies do going forward as far as, and I both agree and disagree with Chris on how bright the line is between what hybrid is, or I should say, are you then a remote first or an office first? But I think it's going to be very interesting to see the world going forward. I think there'll be very, very few companies that say 5 days a week, every week, all the time. Because there's very few companies that were like that historically, by the way.
Right. Well, so then maybe a question for you, and then Chris, I've got one for you, is based on what you just said, do you define yourself, kind of piggybacking off what Chris said, as a remote first company or an office first company? Or are you kind of like both?
I don't, I love Chris. I love both Chris's on the phone. It's not a word that I use, office first or remote first, right? They're just companies, right? And my job as CEO, Chris Hurd's job as CEO, and I guess your job as chairman is to figure out where your employees do their best work, and I think on which days, right? Like 2 years ago, if one of our employees had a doctor's appointment in the suburbs, we wouldn't expect her to schlep back into the city after it. She would go home and do work. One thing I don't think a lot of people really think about. I think a lot of people have been doing hybrid for almost like 2 decades now, right? A lot of people, especially now, there's just always like debate, like how hard are people supposed to work? How many hours a week are people supposed to work? But for most of the last 2 decades, as long as we've had high-speed internet at home, a lot of people do work from home, right? Now, whether that's because they want to rush home to see their kid's soccer game and haven't finished the day's work, or they're one of these overachievers who does work on a Saturday or Sunday, this notion of having both work from home and work from an office has been there. Now, there's this interesting question that actually doesn't impact me too much. We can go into that later, but not me as me, but me as SquareFoot. But we already had, let's say you're one of these overachievers working some time each of 7 days. You were never, or very rarely, going to the office Saturday, Sunday, but you're still doing work. Now the question is, does that 2-day not in office, 5-day in office start looking like 4 and 3 or 3 and 4?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Chris, my question for you is how do you think companies are deciding from the way that you see it? You're either remote first or office first. How are they making that decision? Is that something that they're baking in from when they're founded? Is it industry specific? Does it have to do with how the CEO thinks about the world? How are these companies kind of making these decisions on who they want to be?
Well, I would say, if we go back pre-pandemic, I think the decision was something that was being forced by highly talented people. And I guess in many ways, we're all super privileged that we work in high-paying positions in tech businesses or in sort of white-collar industries. And I think that's not obviously generally the case across all the jobs globally. So I think that's the best place to start. So start before the pandemic. How many people had the opportunity to work remotely as often as they wanted to? And it was probably the open secret in the tech industry that this has been happening, as Jonathan says, for the last 20 years. If you're highly talented and you have a lot of opportunities, you can use that leverage to dictate how often you work from wherever you want to work from. And you can go into Google or Facebook or Amazon or any of these big companies, and this has been happening for a long time. Fast forward to the pandemic, where everyone's forced to work remotely almost simultaneously overnight. We lived through that period of time, and at this point, I don't think any company can argue that remote work doesn't work. I think where you're seeing people try and pull people back to the office full time, it's typically due to a lack of trust. So it's not that they don't think people can work remotely, it's that they don't trust them to do great work without being sat in a seat for 8 hours where they can be watched like a hawk. Now, I expect there's going to be high variance between different industries. I think Jonathan's example of someone needing to sell real estate physically probably has to be in close vicinity to New York in order to go there and obviously meet people in person. And there's going to be a lot of jobs like that, whether it's people working in dispensaries for pharmaceuticals or people working in warehouses or other things. So what I specifically focus on are the 255 million desk jobs globally, where almost all of them can be done remotely, at least a majority of the time. And I think the data coming out here is certainly telling a very distinct story, which is people want more remote work. And actually, that's somewhat surprising to me. Sort of what I touched on before was around this being the worst possible version of remote work. So go back to maybe June or July last year. My concern was a lot of people were going to have this experience and then basically reject remote work after it. And that's not been what's happened. The data that's came out, the surveys we've seen from large companies has suggested the number of people who want to work remotely is growing. And the number of people that want to work remotely more often, i.e. a majority of the time, 3+ days a week, has grown significantly. And I think as the habits and behaviors continue to calcify around what people have experienced and what they want, not having to commute for 2 hours a day, being able to live where they want, being able to see more of their kids, being able to do the things that make them happiest, all while continuing to do the best work that they've ever done in their lives. I think that's something that companies need to acknowledge. Now, to answer your initial question, like what are companies doing here? I think what's been really interesting is some of the things that's happened in some of the large tech companies, where some of them have said, hey, we're going back to the office X amount of time from date Y. And then what's happened internally has been basically a rejection of that from their teams, and they've dictated new policies and they've walked that back pretty quickly. And I think this like pooling and pushing sort of situation is going to probably persist over the next 18 to 24 months as companies grapple with what workers want and what they think they can basically get away with in terms of pulling people back to the office more than they necessarily want to be there.
Chris Powers, can I jump in with one thing real quick?
Yeah.
And because I generally agree. I mean, I think the fun thing is my mom would say, I don't know. What do they say? Agree violently. I agree with most of the stuff Chris Hurd says. I don't know if he agrees with most of the stuff I said in general. But, one thing that I think I'll take a little issue with is this notion that it's all predicated on trust, right? I think, and I say this as a CEO, I think it's predicated on, and this is what I've heard a lot of other CEOs, and maybe it's like signal bias, like everybody likes to tell me their pro-office anecdotes, but it's not about trust. It's about people do better work collaboratively together, right? So now it comes down to specific roles within an organization, probably, where we'll use some stereotypes for a second, but like the average tech person maybe likes to actually code in the middle of the night. So actually an office environment's not ideal for him. Whereas sales team likes to have a rah-rah culture where they're all feeding off each other. Well, it's actually not great if they're in 17 different places. And I don't think it actually comes down to, look, rules are always made for the bad actors. That's in society, that's in office politics. Sorry, not office politics, but offices, that's everywhere. So yes, there are some people maybe who you don't think are going to work. And the only way historically to do that is if they're like next to you. But then they shouldn't be your organization, right? If your only way of policing them is sitting next to them, that's not very scalable, right? So to kind of put a very fine point on it, I don't think it's a trust thing. I think a lot of CEOs somewhere between believe and have seen that people in the office collaborating together is a much better work environment. Much better results as a business. And by the way, I believe all of the stats that Chris Hurd shares, which is that if you ask people, would you rather work from home or work from office? What are they going to say? I think the average person will say, I'd rather work from home, right? It's easier. I don't have to put on pants. I don't have to brush my hair. I don't have to commute. But that the question is not where would you prefer to work from? The question is where do you do your best work? And this is going to be probably provocative, but the average person, and again, we're talking about the averages here, the average person doesn't care if they're doing their best work. The average person is average, right? Most companies are made up of B players, and that's fine. That company is not the one that's pushing the ball forward. And those individual players aren't the ones pushing the ball forward. And those people are happy working on their couch and doing their laundry.
So I agree with almost all of that, right? So trust, and maybe there's a different word that's better to use for that than trust. I think that's the way I certainly see it. Now, I think like the main point of contention around the debate is like, what is the cadence and frequency by which people need to come together physically to maximize that quality of communication and collaboration? So here's something that I've increasingly done with people that I've had this conversation with, which is, okay, I'm willing to concede communication and collaboration is better in office. Now, the thing that you probably have to answer if someone that supports remote work concedes that is, okay, but how much better is it? And I think this is a thing that people just aren't particularly sure about. Like, how much better is it? And I think like there's a lot of different parts that go into that, like that contribute to the quality in the first place, right? Of have we ever met together physically? That's one part. How many times have we met together physically? What kind of personality do you have? What type of role is it? If it's to Jonathan's point, is it a sales role? Is it a design role? Is it an engineering role? And all these things sort of coalesce and probably come together and say, well, salespeople need to meet together, spitballing here, once a week. Engineers need to come together once a quarter. Marketing people need to come together once a month. Now, obviously, Jonathan's perception on how often that is probably going to be a lot higher than mine, and mine's is going to be a lot lower than the average person. But I think there's obviously some exploration needed there, which we just honestly haven't had the opportunity to do because we've lived through a global pandemic. And I think what we're going to live through, particularly over the next 18 to 24 months, and I think we'll start to see some answers to this probably 3 years from now, is just what that breakdown looks like. Now, I think Jonathan's point around the average person in an organization and the average person doing this, I think it's actually super interesting, because I think when you start to go down that path and you say, okay, well, who are the people that are going to have the opportunity to dictate the circumstances that they want to work in? Is it going to be the B players, or is it going to be the most highly qualified and highly sought after people? And I remember seeing an article early in the pandemic. I don't have it, so sorry I can't give you the links, but it was basically around that same premise. And it was like, A players are going to work remote, B players are going to work in office, C players are going to work elsewhere. Now, I don't subscribe to that belief verbatim, because clearly there's going to be incredible people who do want to be in an office far more frequently. But I think there's probably an element of truth in that that could be teased out. Now, one other final thing I'd add to that, which is like, why now? Like, the big question I think everyone's having is, well, why did it not happen before a global pandemic? And I think to Jonathan's earlier point, well, it has been happening, right? There's a lot of people who've worked remotely, if not in that name, for a very long period of time. And for me, I sort of look back through history and I say, okay, well, what can we sort of tie this to that looks similar to the innovation that we're about to see? And for me, I had this conversation with some of the guys at some of our investors who have lived through many of these things. They created the web browser. They built the software that sort of ate the world, so on and so forth. And to me, like, this is a very similar thing. What happened to companies that didn't embrace the internet? What happened to companies that didn't embrace computing? What happened to companies that didn't implement software in the early 2000s? And I think what Jonathan's speaking about earlier around flexibility, the question now is like, what happens to companies that aren't flexible? I think they're going to lose their best people, and they probably get crushed by it over the next decade or so.
Jonathan, anything, or you want me to move it forward?
I have one other anecdote.
Okay.
Because again, I mean, it's fun. Like, we both agree, and there's like, but life always happens in the gray area. Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, look, I'm not in finance, so I don't care, but I think people would say there's like kind of the top two banks, at least when I was graduating from business school 9 years ago. Those were like where everybody wanted to go. And those two companies have been very outspoken, or the CEOs at least, saying, hey, you guys have to come back. And, started hearing that some people are leaving. Those people are leaving and going to kind of bottom of the first tier or top of the second tier firms, who are now using the kind of flexibility as a recruiting like amenity, right? And it's interesting in finance for two reasons. One, there's this question, separate from finance, but in general, is somebody willing to trade prestige for remote? And the answer that the person who is making that change today, leaving Goldman or JP Morgan, is in fact doing that, right? And I think the kind of second question there in finance, or kind of thing to point out in finance, you've always had these kind of bulge bracket firms that include those two and a handful of others. Everybody kind of knows what they're signing up for, right? It's not the most pleasant work experience. And then you have boutique firms. And boutique firms are known for having still, worse work experience than I have, but a more pleasant work experience relative to working at a Goldman or a JP. And for the longest time, you've had people say, I'm fine trading that prestige to have a work-life balance, or more of a work-life balance. So, and that's not explicitly remote or not, but it's that people will self-select into organizations, as they always have. And purely remote, I think, can turn into another one of these recruiting benefits. Again, everybody knows which side of the table I'm on. For people who don't care as much about prestige, especially if prestige has some correlation, and I still believe it does. Sorry, more than correlation, causation with top performers, right? Because Chris brings up a good point, which is how often does somebody need to be in the office or together rather in order to get the best performance? And I think there's some marginal diminishing returns, which is like nobody's in the office 7 days a week, like for collaborative purposes. However, once a week, I don't think is sufficient. Once a month definitely is not, which gets back to if I'm selling stock, I don't care. As long as you have to be in the office a couple times a week, you need the same amount of space. So I ultimately don't care.
Yep. Okay. Does the size of the company or the prestige of the company, we're kind of using that word, matter in the ability for employees to kind of influence this decision? Like a lot of what you read about in the media is obviously like you hear the Apples of the world and the Goldmans of the world. Do those employee bases have more leverage to kind of set their tone on whether they're going to be remote or not? Like more so than maybe a 10-person company might? So maybe like the question is like, how does the size of the company impact this decision-making? And is it irrelevant of what industry they're in? Is it more based on size?
This is based on like not too much, but I don't think anything is necessarily like correlated or causated there. The reason why you hear about Goldman and Apple is because whenever Goldman or Apple do anything, the press likes to write about them. Nobody likes to write about the 12th largest industry player. I mean, look, the funny thing about Apple, they have this like apparently like remote Slack group or like Slack for people who are pro remote. And there's like 2,000 people in that or whatever the number is, which is whatever percentage of Apple. But then there's like 6 people that say, F this, I'm not going back. But when you read that in the press, it says, people know people who aren't going to go back because of it. And the press kind of trumpets that. I think to the extent size matters here, smaller organizations are going to be more likely to be all or the other, right? I don't know if one's right I know which one I think is right. But again, I'll say both things. So if you're like a 7-person startup, there are 2 things, right? One which leads to remote and the other which leads to office, which is your 7 dudes or dudettes. Dudes is a gender neutral term for me. 7 dudes in a basement or a garage, like the kind of, the lore of yesteryear. There's like no replacement for the kind of environment that you can have with just 7 people in a room all the time. Now, the converse to that, now that the world is flat, and the world's been flat since Thomas Friedman wrote that, well, probably if he was writing about it, it had to have happened even before. So like 25 years. So the inverse of that is I want to hire the absolute best and brightest wherever they are, right? And maybe if I'm in, I've never been to Wichita, so I'm not trying to talk trash about Wichita, but if I live in Wichita and I can't hire 6 extremely other best and brightest people, especially if I'm building some like AI thing and the talent pool is just not in Wichita, then my only other option is to put up a job post on like the World Wide Web with emphasis on the world part and say, I'm going to hire the best AI person I can find regardless of where they are.
Yeah, again, like a lot of anecdotes, right? Like I got a lot of DMs from people that work at some of these large organizations, and the anecdotes I have is, hey, I would rather quit than go back to the office full time. Now, the real distinction there is full time. Like almost nobody wants to go back to an office every day, all the time. And I'd like to Jonathan's point. I have no idea. Like people say they're going to do things, and the reality of the situation often changes what they're going to act like. I think what's undeniable is that a far larger number of people are going to work remotely full time after the pandemic than did before. And if we want to throw some hard numbers at that, we go back to 2008, somewhere between 3.8 and 5 million people worked remotely in the US. Post-pandemic, the numbers are looking like it's going to be somewhere between 25 and 30 million people. And if they continue at the rate of growth, they'll hit somewhere around 80 million people globally by 2030. And obviously, the sort of implication of that is that the large organizations are going to be the ones most affected by that because they employ the most people. The examples of all the banks that we've been speaking about are interesting because their CEOs have basically came out and said, hey, we're going to do this. And And I think the question I would always have on that is like, how much of that is protectionism of the real estate that they own, and how much of it is sort of swimming against the current of time in terms of what people are actually going to demand. And I think if you look at the sort of outflux of people from those traditional sectors over the last 20 years towards tech, I think people will more than ever begin to optimize for the situations that they're happiest in. And to Jonathan's earlier point, some people are always going to want to pursue prestige, and that's going to mean working at a Goldman Sachs 5 days a week, 100 hours a week, 100 hours a week. It's going to be working at McKinsey. And I think like the alternative play we'll have here is that there'll be this remote work dilemma of sorts that emerges, where the people potentially that aren't Goldman or aren't McKinsey will say, we're going to let you work remotely more than these other people. And because so many people do want to work remotely, their ability to attract highly talented people is probably going to increase. At some point, we may hit some equilibrium where people have found the situation that they love and there's some rebalancing. But I think there's going to be a lot of, I would say over the next 5 years, we're going to have the highest period of turnover in history between companies because of this, as people optimize for the living situations they need the most. And a lot of those big companies are going to pay the price for not giving people what they expect.
You think there's any danger, and we're kind of putting our CEO hats on here, maybe it has a little bit to do with remote work, but this idea that, hey, if you left Goldman and you did it because you just can't stand to show up in an office, is that like destructive to your career going forward? And maybe to add on to that is there going to be this bifurcation where it's like kind of what we were talking about around the prestige, where it's just like, Goldman holds firm and it's like, okay, the people that work at Goldman are obviously hard workers. They've chosen prestige, like they're elevating themselves, and folks that want to work all over the country and just work wherever they want are kind of diluting their self-worth. I think you guys know what I'm asking, but like, how do you think about that in the context of like people leaving and, more prestigious companies staying in the office, et cetera, et cetera?
So I would take that from the perspective, like I'll speak to my own position as a CEO. We are now able to hire people who we could, quite frankly, never have hired before, because they want to pursue opportunities that give them the balance in their lives that they never had before. And I think like this is a secondary conversation where we're just starting to get into the weeds on this. But I think actually when you start to distill that down and you look at it through the lens of like mass societal issues right now, there's a lot of, I think, crisis that people have around meaning and depth of relationships. And you can sort of zoom back through time and say, well, what did people do 50 years ago? And all these things come together, like the elongation of the workday, the 2-hour daily commute, not spending as much time with our friends and our family, and not having hobbies outside of the office. All these things have contributed to people not having those things. They just don't have the same depth of relationships that they had before. They don't derive the same meaning from those types of things, their hobbies and things that make them happy. People are spending somewhere between 60 and 80% of their time either getting ready for, commuting to, or being sat in an office. That just doesn't leave you any time to really do the things that you need to be happy outside of work. And I think, look, I'm speaking to this from the perspective of a European. So my position on like the amount of time people need off work to have those things is very different than what it is in the US,
Touché.
Right? But yeah, I think that's certainly been the case for us, and certainly in some of the later stage conversations we're having with senior leaders we hope to join in the coming months. A large part of it is like we want to do great work. We don't necessarily want to live in New York or San Francisco or London or wherever else.
And there's two things I'll say there. One, and this is again not necessarily good or bad. It just depends what a society wants. Let's assume that America is more prone to longer hours than Europe. Not for nothing, America's had higher GDP and higher GDP growth kind of for a long, long time. And by the way, there's people who now play the not anti-America, but America not always in first. There's companies who eat countries who eat our lunch, right? Like China. Like if we want to talk about like work-life balance, like I don't even think they have the second word there. And they're making up stats, whatever. But there's other countries we could come up with where they kind of eat our lunch from a GDP perspective. Now you can say, great, are we all here to work and have good GDP, or are we here to enjoy our Mai Tais in Mykonos? And in the latter, I won't call out Greece, but like innovation happens to have come from the US. Now, is it because we work harder? I don't know. I think there's a bunch. I won't go on my like pro-America rant right now. I think there's a bunch of things that make America special. I do think, however, if we stop working as hard, we are going to slow down, because that's just how it works. It's like if you were training for an event, it's the Olympics right now. You don't train if you train 100% or 70%. I think everybody knows how that winds up in the medal count. Not U.S., but like on any given person, right? So that's kind of one thing I'd point out. Two, I think it's a false dichotomy that I sometimes try and chide Chris Hurd on Twitter about, but this notion of like you can't, only in this remote environment do you make friends. Only in this remote environment are you able to hug your kid, right? I hang out with my kid every morning before I go to the office on the days I go to the office, and I make sure I'm home unless there's like I'm hanging out with friends or something. I make sure I'm home to hang out with him before bed. And I'm clearly one of the biggest proponents of office space in the entire world. Not to mention, one of the stories I always like to tell is when I was starting my career at JLL, I was actually also on a team that was completely remote. It was international capital. So it was me and my boss in DC, and there's analogous like managing director, associate pairs in all the kind of global financial capitals. Fast forward, we sat in obviously like JLL's DC office. Fast forward now kind of 14 or 15 years from my first day. Aside from my boss, I don't talk to anybody else who worked on that team with me. I still talk to several people who sat next to me on a weekly, if not monthly basis, right? And we worked at the same company. We didn't work on any projects together. We didn't work on any teams together. But proximity to people builds relationships, right? And there's a lot of, I'd like to think I'm like, not a social moron, so I'm able to make friends. But there's people who find friends at work, and that's a really good thing. I also had friends outside of work, but picture somebody who's new to a city who moves there for any number of reasons. Work as an office is a way where relationships get made and built over time. So I think that's like a false dichotomy. You're either in an office not having relationships.
I would push back on that, and just on the fact like it's interesting to ask the question. Like I agree, but should that be the case?
I don't know. I mean, I think. Well, the question. Which part are you pushing back on?
You're positing that like people do make relationships at work. Well, clearly, right? But like the bigger question, I think, and there's no answer to this. This is like a personal preference thing. But the bigger question then comes like, okay, like that is true. Like people make a lot of their relationships at work. People find their spouses at work. People find their best friends at work. But should your employer's HR team be the people that are selecting who you spend most time with? Like, does that lead ultimately to good outcomes, or does it create a lot of the societal issues that we face?
So I think those are two separate questions, kind of both interesting. If you have a well-run organization, and there's this big question like, A, what does that mean? And B, how many organizations are well-run? I'll talk about SquareFoot, which who knows if we'll check either of those boxes, but we hire a certain type of person, separate from the brokers, right? Because the brokers are always going to be a separate type of person. Although within the brokerage community, we have a separate type of broker from elsewhere. But I think companies live and die by their cultural values. It's like one of these like first things they tell you when you start building a startup. And so if the HR process, which we're talking about, is actually doing a good job, you're making hiring and firing decisions based on those core values of the business. And the core values of the business are not like make more money. Like here at SquareFoot, intellectual curiosity, going the extra mile, and working together, right? So if we are actually hiring and firing decisions based on that, then you're going to actually, I'm thrilled that the HR department is helping me self-select, not me as CEO of SquareFoot, but me as an employee of a company. I'm thrilled that somebody's out there searching for people who ascribe to my same values. So that's one. Two, I don't know where people are supposed to make friends. I think that people struggle making friends, period, oftentimes, right? So people make friends at like when they're their first day in college. People make a bunch of friends, and then their college friends are like their friends for life. People make friends kind of when they play sports or do Boy Scouts or whatever else somebody does as a kid. People make friends in the work environment. I don't know that anyone is better or worse. They're all different arenas, right? What I do think, and actually, I agree, right? I think that there's this like loneliness pandemic, or I probably should use that word differently now, but like people talk about the challenges of loneliness in society these days. I actually, there's surely correlation. There's almost surely not causation that comes from working long hours, especially because I believe people make friends at work. Now, what also has happened in those intervening 50 years or 80 years, whatever time scale you were talking about, is people spent more time online, right? We are actually not face to face with people making meaningful connections. So you feel like, oh, I'm talking to, you guys have so many more Twitter followers than I have. I'm talking to 2,600 of my closest friends on Twitter every day. I feel like I'm connected to the world, right? But I'm not. And by the way, even if I had whatever you guys have, you have so many more. So I don't know. Maybe you guys feel like you're making lifelong friends. I know that Chris Hurd goes like mountain climbing with people he meets on Twitter.
That's
So,
Powers.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. That's what I meant. Chris Powers. So I think that the internet, and I love the internet, right? I have a tech-enabled company. Everything is good. But I think the loneliness thing is actually tied to people spending more time alone in their basements. And they feel that they're making all these meaningful relationships because you have a lot of interactions with people, but they're not deep and meaningful.
Well, so I think that's interesting as well, right? Like Chris, the people you meet online, like to Jonathan's point, like do you feel connected to all those Twitter followers, or do you build relationships with the ones that you have? I don't want to say special relationships with, but like things that you go out and do, so you have an experience together, right?
Yeah, I think it can go back to. I mean, I think we can all feel this. Like when you find people that share your values, even if you can kind of feel it and seek it out, even through Twitter messaging. I've got thousands of followers and I interact with a lot of them, but there's probably, just like in life, there's probably 10 or 15 of them that I've actually become like genuinely friends with. I chat with outside of Twitter. We have a lot in common, and there was no it's not like we did any speed dating. And it's just kind of, the people that share values kind of over time end up in the same room. And the ones you don't. So, I've been fortunate to meet a lot of great people. Obviously, I have a lot more followers. I don't think I'm making a lot more best friends as I get more followers, but I'm, if anything, the more people that you interact with, the more quickly you can identify like what's important to you and what's not. Because at the end of the day, I think it's a small subset of the world that share those exact values that are important to you. Not that other people's values are bad. It's just kind of the natural way it works. I don't know if I answered that question right, but yeah.
Yeah, I think like this gets somewhat deep and philosophical, right? Like I'm from a small city in Scotland. There's less than 200,000 people there. What is the likelihood that I find what I would like colloquially known as your tribe? What is the likelihood that you find your tribe in a city of that size versus New York or LA or any of these mega cities where the opportunity to meet people more like you is far higher? So I think like there's certainly like an aspect of like the different experiences and expectations of what is like geographically accessible to you, right? And then I think like to Jonathan's point, like maybe for some people like online is that same thing. Like I don't live in New York, but now I have access to 7 billion people online, where I can gravitate towards the people that are more likely like me. And I think like the crux of the argument is like, okay, like people, you can meet people at the office and they can become lifelong friends, and you can do the same thing at school, and you can do the same thing at college. And I played semi-professional soccer for 15 years. I met a lot of friends there. But I think for me, like I reflect back on all that stuff and I say, okay, like how many people do I still speak to from my last job? How many the one before that? How many do I speak to for the last team I played for before I retired? How many before that? And there's obviously a decreasing number of people always in that situation. So I'm not saying like you shouldn't meet friends in the office. I just like, it's an open question that I have for myself. It's like, okay, should this be the place that we make the key relationships in our lives? Or should we be in a situation where people get to do the things that make them happier? And they obviously meet people more like them off the back of that.
Well, and when you go to the discussion about high performers and, we keep using the word prestige, but folks that want to just crush it, I would fair to say you talk to the majority of them, and the reason why they're joining companies is not to make a bunch of best friends. I think that's a byproduct along the way, but they're there to perform first, and then probably the friendship kind of attitude comes second. It's probably not why they joined the company to begin with.
To buy Toby, whatever his name is, from Spotify. Sorry, Shopify. He's definitely not going to respond to me now if I.
He'll be listening to this 100%. So you should worry about it.
Well, between your two Twitter followings, I'm not sure who won't hear it. So anyway, he recently came out and said, Shopify's not a family; we're a team.
Yeah. Reed Hastings says the same thing. I don't know if you've read his book, No Rules, Rules.
Yeah.
We do the same thing.
And by the way, Netflix is one of those like super cutthroat's probably the wrong word, but like they like will happily pay you a lot of money to leave after you start there if it's not a right fit.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, you can't fire a family member. You can't, there's just a lot you can't do as family that you can do with team. And okay, question. How are we going to know, like, what are the signals or the data points that we're looking at if we were to set like a goal 5 years from now and we're kind of coming out of the pandemic and remote work is going to take a new shape where it's not this forced kind of lockdown style? Like, what are we looking for to know what the appropriate amount of time together is and which industries should be in the office and what are the things that matter in kind of coming to conclusion? Is there anything that comes to mind, or is it just like, let's just see what happens and we'll be able to answer that 5 years from now?
I mean, I certainly wouldn't throw out any specific metrics around what I think would indicate that. I think, like, honestly, I think we're about to live through the highest period of workforce and workplace innovation in history. And I think what we're going to do is escape from many of the sort of industrial revolution norms that have persisted as people went from factory line working to office working, which just haven't altered to enable people to do deep focused work, which is what most of us do. We're knowledge-based workers. And in a knowledge economy, like the metric that measures that is always going to be productivity. How much productivity are you getting from people? And I think there's probably going to be a lot of people far smarter than us crunching this data in some of the top universities in the world over the next 3 to 5 years. And these small scale studies that have been done in a couple of travel agents in China and places like that have suggested remote work is more efficient will either be proven true as more people do it or not. But I think what's undoubtedly true is there's going to be a big shift in where people are expected to be. I think we're going to see a lot of people probably decentralize away from some of the bigger cities, and we're going to see a lot of people move into them who work remotely because, let's be honest, cities are still pretty great places to live. It's just the commuting that makes them less good to live in. So I don't know, Jonathan, you may have better metrics than I do and better indications of things that would suggest one mode's working better than the other.
Yeah, no, I don't have specific metrics, but we hit on another hot button issue of mine, which is just build more housing, right? So if you have, whether it's any of these big metropolises, whether it's New York or LA, I mean, I grew up in Houston, which is as spread out of a city as it gets. You want to decrease housing prices so that somebody doesn't have to commute as much, build a shit ton, excuse my French, more housing, right? I wish that people don't have to commute so far, because what I do believe is that the average employee, separate from, I was talking about averages earlier, but most people in most jobs work better around people more of the time. So I'm not as comfortable as some folks, not just on this call, but in general, making like absolute statements. But I think most people, most of the time, should be in an office, right? And I'm sure there's a call center in China where when you stop coming to the call center, which is probably not the most collaborative environment in the first place, they're more productive. Because there's this interesting thing about like productivity as the metric too. People and this is going to take a few years to play out, right? Because people are in meetings all day or on Zoom all day, and they're like, "Oh man, I'm so tired. I had such a long day. I was on these Zoom meetings all day," and then they conflate busyness with productivity. And people were definitely busy going from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting. And what historically was a 30-second tap on the shoulder is now a more turns into like, hey, do you have a minute to hop on Zoom? And those are never 30 seconds. So I think that, look, there's this dream that people talk about in tech of like a purely asynchronous workforce that works on, there's 24 hours in the day, there's 24 time zones, and you have people everywhere, and you have this like beautiful documentation that the Collison brothers have written themselves, and everybody's just crystal clear and on the same page. And then you have how every other person in company actually operates, right? Because rules are not meant to be there, whether it's rules or like structures, are not made for outliers, right? They're made for like the middle percentage of a distribution. And you have to recognize that that's where where definitionally most people are.
Yep. Okay. Where are all these people going? So like if you took the 2,000 folks at Apple that don't want to go into the office anymore, want to work remote, are a lot of these people still staying in their same city and maybe just working in a coffee shop, or maybe they found a WeWork, or a lot of these people actually migrating to new places and setting up shop, and like uprooting their life? When I think of somebody not wanting to go back, I still haven't gotten clear on whether they're just like, leaving the Bay Area altogether in the context of Apple, or if they're just staying put, they're just not going to the office anymore. They're just staying close by so that they can get there when and if they need to be there for collaboration.
I think go ahead, Chris. Heard. I think that this migration has happened a lot less than people would have guessed, for the reasons that Chris Hurd just pointed out, which is a lot of people want to live in cities. People didn't historically gravitate to cities necessarily because I think it was actually a tail wagging the dog. You said, great, I want to go live in New York, so I'm going to go look for a job in New York. Or I live in Chicago, I'm going to go look for a job in Chicago. Or I'm from one of those places and I want to live there. Because I think this notion of this nomadic lifestyle sounds like pretty romantic for a 25-year-old. Probably would have been romantic for me 13 years ago. But look, we all have families. Like the notion of like every 3 months we're going to go live in a different city is pretty disruptive to our kids. So the notion that a majority of the workforce, especially a majority of the high talent part of the workforce, which is separate from being good, but just more years in the workforce, more likely to have a family, I'll say is less likely to kind of hop in an RV and travel the country working from exotic locales while they do their work. And I think cities actually, there was some actually like real data today, like the great migration out of cities didn't happen by and large, right? Now, you did have people leaving certain cities, I would say for kind of geopolitical reasons, like San Francisco. Again, all I know in life is what I learn on Twitter, is like in disarray. So people leave San Francisco, or people leave New York because it's high tax. But those people who leave San Francisco or leave New York don't go to Bozeman, Montana, as beautiful as Bozeman is. They go to Miami or they go to Austin, which are big cities last I checked.
I think that vibes for what it's worth. Like I think people were swapping cities for other cities that they wanted to live in. Now, I think there has been an element of decentralization, but it's not been the nomads that Jonathan refers to. It's been families moving out of the city to have more space for their kids to grow up in. And I think actually that's going to be a trend that I would expect to continue. And I think like in a certain way, that's the key part about a key element of remote work is about that decentralization, certainly from the perspective of can we enable it? And really what we're talking to there is like, how can we empower not just like people like us, like we're super lucky, like we can work in offices, our parents, our dads certainly probably worked in offices, many of them. And they benefited disproportionately from that. And I think like the exciting thing for other people is like, okay, like does this open up the doors for us to access opportunity? And I think that's sort of an underlooked element of what we've spoken about for the last nearly hour. Like how can remote work enable people to access opportunity who otherwise or historically couldn't? So we're talking about single parents, or we're talking about people that may have to help and care for family members that are sick, or we're talking about people that have health conditions or impairments that make it really difficult, if not impossible, to work in an office. So I think in many ways, remote work actually does more to expand the overall talent pool at the same time. And I think, like, yeah, to Jonathan's point, I think like this perception of what's happened is people are like, well, we're going to move out the city and we're going to live out in the sticks and we're going to farm and we're going to have chickens. Like, just not the reality of what's actually happened.
I say that, by the way, just started gardening and just set up a compost bin at my suburban house. So I'm in love with the.
So you're one of them.
Yeah, but I'm a 30-minute train ride into the city.
Like one interesting thing. I don't know if you've seen the table that Paul Graham tweeted yesterday.
No, I'll look.
So it was this like odd colored thing, and it broke down like preferred places to start a technology company from for long-term success. And it was like looking at what people had said pre-pandemic and looking at what people had said now. And obviously there's the standard places that you would imagine. San Francisco was 40% of places. Other US cities was 9%. New York was 13.5%. LA was 13.5%, Seattle, and then cities outside of the US. And then obviously remote or distributed was another, and it was only 5 or 6% of the total. Now, San Francisco, to your geopolitical point, is down below 30%. New York's halved. Los Angeles is at a quarter, and remote has, try to do quick maths here, 7x in the space of 12 months. So I think there's like an element of truth in that. I think for certainly smaller tech companies who, to Jonathan's earlier point, need to hire the best person on the planet, not just the best person they can afford in a prescribed area. I thought that was an interesting data point, whether it turns out to be true or not.
And one thing I would add that I kind of maybe mentioned in passing, like I ultimately don't care where the average person works. Average, again, not meaning like B player, but where most people work. I just don't want them to work from home, right? If you go to WeWork, I do a ton of business with WeWork. Have fun. You want to go to any co-working company, we do a ton of business there. We just bought something called Upsuite to specifically focus on that part of the market. So to the extent I selfishly, from a professional perspective, have any dog in the fight, I am not anti-distribution. I'm anti-work from home. And one of these things that gets conflated, one, is work from home and remote. Right. So all work from home is remote. Not all remote is work from home. Right. So SquareFoot, as we mentioned at the top of the call, is a remote organization. We have offices in 6 cities. Nobody works from home most of the time.
Yeah. Well, so here's the other side of that equation. There will be Firstbase clients who are not remote companies.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Chris, you can dig that. This is like how little ego I have on everything. You can ask Chris Hurd. You can dig up the email. I first emailed Chris Hurd like 18 months ago when I first heard about Firstbase, and I didn't follow up with him after that. But I said, I'm going to see more of our clients are going to spend some of their time not at home. I think we might be able to work together. And I think I also tried to invest then. He didn't respond to that one, and I didn't follow up. That was like early pandemic. I was probably pretty depressed with my day job. And then a few weeks ago, Chris Hurd, good on him, raised a nice little round, and I heard about it just before they announced, and I said, hey, love to get involved. And at that point it was too late too, but I'm like not anti any of this, right? But I told you what my 5-day a week looks like. I'm in the office 3 days because there's absolutely no substitute for it, and 2 days a week I'm at home. I have a good work from home environment. We didn't get into the whole, like, a lot of people don't have that fortune, so it's not fair, but I don't like using that word. But this notion of either or, again, I don't think much in life is in the black and the white. It's in the gray, right? And I think if you got, like, this is where Chris and I might actually not agree, right? Which is, I believe most people should be in the office most of the time, right? That means that some people, some of the time, are not in the office, which means me as CEO of SquareFoot needs to figure out the best way to get those folks working on a day-to-day basis on the time that they're not together, right? But it also means most that most people are in the office 3 days a week here, and a lot of our all of our clients, otherwise they wouldn't be our clients. And that's all I ultimately care about am I going to make any money with my day job, right? People are going back to the office because they believe in the value of the office. Even if they don't believe they need to be there 5 days a week. Because, by the way, a lot of people already worked some portion of 7 days a week and they weren't in the office 7 days. So now you'll just have lower office utilization, which is fine because I don't believe hoteling is successful. So I ultimately don't care, actually. This is all really fun from a philosophical perspective, but it's not going to impact my day job very much.
Yeah, and I think like Jonathan's point there is like interesting on the sort of prelude on our interactions over the time. Like, I think we both have like trust that this is a good faith conversation, right? Like, a lot of the stuff that we say on social media is if Jonathan says black and I say white, or I say black, Jonathan's going to say white, because that's what social media is. And I think like the thing that then happens, like if it is a good faith like relationship, you can come together and you can have a debate that actually exchanges ideas that acknowledge, well, yeah, maybe it's not black and maybe it's not white and there is shades of gray, but that's not fun on social media.
let that be a lesson. My other soapbox is that what Chris Hurd just said very eloquently is my soapbox on everything political, right? Because you just have all these morons who say either left or right, and then they hate everybody who says the other, or let's say up or down, because left or right actually has political connotations, up or down, and nothing in life is up or down. And it's only having good faith conversations about where the middle area is, where society moves forward. There's my stump speech for the day, Mr. Powers.
I want to get through two more kind of topics. Y'all are very generous with your time. The first just being, and again, this might just be like philosophy. When I think about like the work from home kind of remote world, and I'm tying this now back to students coming out of college or young people that have never had the luxury of working in a pre-pandemic kind of work life. And you've seen the data about like, these college students that were forced to take classes remotely and do everything remotely. It was kind of a wasted year in education by some stretch of the imagination. Is like, how do y'all think about these people coming out of college or not? And their first day of work is, they're by themselves, and whether it's an office or a home, and they kind of work that way, and that's how they start. Like, do you guys have an opinion on whether they should be around, mentors and folks that have experience in the business world? Or do you think that these people can be trained up, without that human interaction? Or do they need more attention than folks that do have experience? I think you know what I'm asking here.
Yeah, maybe I'll take this one first. So my sister is literally that person. She experienced her last year and a half studying remotely. She just began working for an investment fund in the UK, and she's living exactly that. And they are a very traditional investment company. So I think they had a lot of preconceptions about what younger people could and couldn't do, and the challenges and issues that they would face, both with respect to getting work done, with understanding like the expectations, with respect to just learning from people that people think you need to be around in order to gain skills and experiences that you can't otherwise get. Now, to acknowledge Chris's point, I think like the real key thing that's been highlighted here is like how much time people waste at university, probably more than anything else. Like that people could do all the work that they did normally, and it just hasn't taken as much time. Now, granted, people may not have had the same experience that they otherwise would have from university. They've obviously missed out on that. And I think that's undoubtedly true. But I'm not sure there's been like a higher or lower degree of work done. They still did their exams. They still did all their coursework. Everything was still marked to the same extent. So I don't think there was any difference like related to that. It was just the experience part. Now, having went into that situation, I think she is the best generation in history to deal with what they're going to face. And fortunately for her, her company has created this digital experience in terms of onboarding and getting her set up for success and connecting her with the right mentors internally and making sure she's supported to do everything that she does. So I think like there's still a perception in the old guard in these companies that it can't be done, but it's more because they don't think it can be done and they don't understand how virtual learning works. Now, the second point I would make, which is like the question that I often get, is like, what about the young folks in cities that are living in shared apartments and they just can't work remotely and they can't work from home? And I think that's a good point. I think there's obviously that's the case for a lot of people. If they're in New York, they obviously don't have 2-3 bedroom apartments with office spaces, which we may all have. Um, my pushback on that's always a question, which is like, okay, is this an issue with remote work, or is it an implication with the high cost of living in cities because there's not enough space and you need to commute for 2 hours a day? And actually, they may not necessarily want to work at home, but if there's a hyper local micro space that they can go to and work, whether it's a coffee shop or it's someone else's space or it's a WeWork or something else, then they probably prefer to work there than traveling for 2 hours into an office. So yeah, two points that I think I've observed, and yeah, certainly happy to give my sister's confirmation that that's actually true.
Yeah, one thing I never got around to tweeting. I was A group of business school students reached out to me. One person reached out on behalf of them. I think there was like 10 to 20 of them who all had internships this summer, who were all remote, and they reached out, said, "Hey, like I don't want to work remote. Can you guys help us find an office?" So that tells us kind of two things. One, like they didn't really want to be remote. Great, obviously. Otherwise, why are they reaching out asking for an office? And two, kind of why, right? Because they wanted to be around people. Interestingly enough, these were people that they weren't even going to be working with, right? They were sad they weren't going to be around their mentors, because I actually don't think you can mentor successfully remotely. Sorry, let me phrase it differently. If you have the choice between mentoring remotely and mentoring in person, which does one pick? And I think we know the answer to that question, right? Look, I met my wife on SquareFoot client Hinge, right? Hinge is a fantastic way to meet your significant other. So are all the others, right? My wife and I have a 14-month-old who I adore. As much as I might have tried, you can't do that online. And mentoring is that same way. Like when I think about my first couple of bosses out of college, it wasn't just like, hey, like this is how you do the job. It was like, this is how you're a professional in society. And that's something that you can't really write a book about, right? Because by the way, the other example I'll use, aside from my like, how do you make a baby? Like, you can't read a book to learn how to ride a bike. And then the question winds up being, is the mentorship in certain types of jobs, like, Chris can come up with the example of something that you can learn just by reading. And then riding the bike is the one that you can't. And the question is, and by the way, like I said, one size doesn't fit all. So the question is, the jobs that, or the answer rather, the jobs where mentorship is like learning how to ride a bike, you can't do that remotely. And then again, I don't know like what you can do. I'm sure there are. It's not me trying to be a dickhead. But whatever one could learn just by reading, that's a great job to learn remotely and expect no loss of like goodness.
Yeah, and like what gets interesting, like when you go down that path, is like maybe the example is like analyzing yields on bonds. I don't know. And there's elements of that job where some things are intangible, some things aren't intangible. So it's like, what's the breakdown where you can maximize the return on the investment in the person that you're employing by empowering them with all the skills and experiences they need to do the best possible work that they can do. And I think that probably circles us back to the initial part of the conversation, which was like, there's going to be different cadences for different roles. Like for sales, it's going to be different for technology and engineering, is going to be different for marketing, is going to be different for accountants, so on and so forth. And I think organizations are really going to have to grapple with this to really understand the implications of the decisions and choices that they're making with respect to how much time do we spend together in real life, because I won't use Jonathan's example of making a baby with your teammate. But yeah, maybe it's, I don't know, making a cake or something different. But it's that example where it's like, yeah, look, there's some things, most things can be done virtually, some things shouldn't be done virtually, most things can be done in person, most things maybe shouldn't be done in person. There's a lot of give and take on both sides of that.
And not for nothing, like all of our jobs is like running an organization. It's just got a shit ton harder, right? Because you now have to figure all this stuff out. Like there was enough stuff that was hard to figure out last year or 2 years ago. Everything just got harder and also more expensive, right? Because I actually don't think the average company is going to have less office space because of if you're going to be in the office 2 or 3 days a week, you need the same amount of space. And we're seeing that with our clients. And then now we also have to figure out like, how do you have a culture in a company that's successful with some people not in the office some of the time. So you have to get better at a lot of things.
Well, that might bring up an interesting point on the some people being remote, some not. I think maybe if this remote's been going on for 20 years, are people going to get promoted that are in the room that if you're not in the office often or you're not being seen often, you might not be promoted at the same pace? Is there any data around that?
I certainly haven't seen any data. I don't know if you have, Jonathan.
No, I haven't. I mean, not even anecdotally, but gut would say not, right? Which is either fair or not fair, but it is the way of life. But there's like this other thing, which is getting promoted look, and everybody always talks about like the archetype, right? So there's like the political animal who like doesn't really do any work, but then, sucks up to the boss at the coffee maker and then gets promotion. I don't think that that's the typical thing. What I will say is that, and I'll use myself again as an example, I'm sorry, but like when I was at JLL, I got to work on projects with a CEO who happened to be in DC some of the time and maintain an office there. But that wouldn't have happened if we weren't both in the same office. I was like 100 degrees removed from Colin. But because we were both in the same office, and I was good at my job, I got access to him in a way that had I not been in the same office, even if we were both in the same city of DC, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to do.
Okay, my last kind of topic, I've got y'all for about 10 more minutes. Again, thank you. Let's just talk about kind of the trust. And I more want to talk about, because Jonathan, you are like, your company is remote, even though you work in offices. And then obviously Chris's background.
Distributed.
Distributed. Okay, we'll call it distributed. Is that idea around trust and tracking, and are companies more safe if they're fully, even from like a security and cyber risk? Maybe my first question is, if people are starting to go more remote and they're not, people can kind of be off the grid, they're not seen in person often. Are a lot of these companies setting up tracking devices on computers? Like, does it become more invasive or less invasive? And is that a company decision, or like, what are the trends around how people are making sure that people are working? And then maybe adding in one more is like, and maybe these are just, clickbait articles, but these clickbaits on people that are like, I'm working 10 jobs, and the other 9 have no idea about it. I'm making $1 million a year and I get fired every 6 weeks and I just get another job. So that's a loaded question, but there it is.
I don't even know where to start on unpacking that. The last point, I think, is this is something that's went on for a long time with like, you hear the same thing about freelancers and contractors like 5-10 years ago. I'm sure it is happening. I'm sure it's happening at like 0.0000001%. It's probably like one person in a million or one person in however many. So I don't imagine that's happening to any extent that it ever becomes an issue. Your first point, I think, is super, super key here, which is like, are we going to allow surveillance tech to proliferate and just have this situation where I'm not watching you do work, I'm not watching you sit in that seat for 8 hours a day, but I'm watching every keystroke that you make, every web page that you view, and everything that you do on this machine. That's going to lead to an absolutely disastrous situation. That's like the dystopian future that I think we can all agree on would not be a good outcome for anyone. There's definitely been an emergence of a few technologies that can do that. We would never recommend that to anyone, nor would we be party to doing that. I don't think that's the way to go. If you're going to trust, if you're going to employ someone, you employ them because you trust them. And if they break your trust, then maybe they shouldn't work for the company anymore. I think in most jobs, it's pretty apparent in terms of whether someone is producing quality work or not. And if it isn't, it's often a problem with management not having anything tangible that they can measure performance against. And typically, that's an indication that an organization maybe isn't a particularly effective place in terms of knowing how much work is being produced. Um, but yeah, I think this is something I grapple with and have conversations with people a lot. Your final point on the security part, which again, like, do you have a laptop for your employer? Like, do you work on a plane flying to San Francisco? Can someone look over your shoulder in that plane and then tweet about what you've been doing for a company that's a $50 billion company and share the next 3 years of what that company is planning to do? Like, that's an actual thing that happens. So I don't think that changes because people are working remotely. I think when people are working remotely, they're typically doing it. I mean, if you look at the stats, I can't remember the company's Global Workplace Analytics shows where most people work while they're working remotely. It's at home, or it's in coffee shops, or it's in co-working spaces. I think the same sort of issues that persist with people having laptops is just the same thing again. Maybe to a slightly higher degree, but not to a worrying degree, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. Most people don't do interesting enough work that anybody cares. Like, to feel it. Like some putz working at the coffee shop on like whatever. Like the Soviets don't care. That's my thought on
Jonathan, always with the hot take. Okay. This has been fantastic. If I just gave you guys the floor, maybe like one or two more minutes each, if there's anything like we didn't talk about or a point that maybe I missed that maybe we could call it our closing statements. We could do that, or we can wrap it up. But this has been fantastic.
Chris, do you have anything? You don't have. We can also both just cede the floor, but you can go first. Otherwise, not so I can have the last word. I won't contradict anything.
Well, I was speaking at a GitLab event a couple of weeks ago, and the final question was like, okay, like what's the hope here? Like, we have an opportunity to like reset certain things where certain things may be out of whack. And I think ultimately what my answer was like, look, we've spent a lot of time speaking about the future of work and blah, blah, blah. Who gives a shit about that? Like, what we're really talking about is the future of living. Like, to me, that's the crux of it. Like, can we enable people to live better lives where they're happier and at the same time do better work? And I think ultimately that's the future I want to help propagate. And certainly my take on that is the best way to do that is to give people the opportunity to choose where they do their work from. And obviously my take on that is that more remote is a choice they should be given in order to do that. And I think like the only thing I would add to that, like if that's the belief you subscribe to, I would hope that you go about doing it in the right way. I touched on some of the DEI stuff earlier, which is about like empowering more people to be able to access opportunity. I think that's incredibly important, obviously, because I think it gives more people the opportunity to earn a living and live a life where they have more disposable income and all the things that come with that. So I think that's one part. The second part would be like, if you are going to go remotely, don't just replicate the office virtually. Don't just replicate the office remotely. Don't just do the same things. If you do need to go to an office, go and do that whenever it needs to happen. Go and do the things that you need to do there in terms of whiteboarding or communication and collaboration. But I don't see the two things as being analogous. Like, there's a lot of things that you can do remotely that you can never do in an office. And equally, there's a lot of things you can do in an office that you can never do remotely. So it's about looking at each of those things, maximizing the benefits of both, and then trying to become a better organization as a result, because you can produce better work as a whole.
All I heard was say maximizing office, so I'm good. I think, well, look, one thing that I saw, this is probably 6 months ago, somebody said, a CEO of like a decent sized startup. So like, Series C type company, like probably a few hundred people, not a few thousand people, said, we're giving up our office because it's not fair. Okay, that's interesting, right? And why isn't it fair? The second sentence is because, not everybody can come into the office. So implicit with that actually is the belief that in office is better, right? And also that they're solving for equality. And there's a big thing about like equality versus equity. And that's also definitely not a soapbox I'm about to get on. Definitely not today, probably not ever. But I think that's like an important thing to think about, right? Top performers, I believe, perform best in the office, right? The same way the Olympics, like you train in the ideal training scenario, which is whatever that is. I'm not a good athlete, so I don't know. And if one believes that the ideal working environment is in the office with people who you're working with, again, most of the time, then the office isn't going anywhere, right? And that doesn't mean that more people aren't going to spend more time not at their desk, right? I'll say myself as an example again. But the other thing I'll say, right, as much as I love working from home Mondays and Fridays, I get to like tickle my kid during coffee breaks. That's a trade-off that I'm making, right? That's time that I'm not spending building a relationship at the water cooler. Now, it's a trade-off I'm happy to make. I'm loving being a new dad. But I'd also be lying if I said that that was a costless trade. Again, it's a trade I'm very happy making. But as with most things in life, every plus has a minus, every minus has a plus. And my big takeaway with kind of everything, both here and in general, is that the only way to have an intellectually honest conversation about what's right for a company, for a person, for a family, is to recognize all of that. And, we've talked about it both. And like I said, I think there's more agreement than not between Chris and myself on this, but life happens in the gray. And I think we will all be better off recognizing that going forward, as long as part of the gray is in office.
Yeah. So what's funny about your sports analogy is nobody trains in the stadium.
But they don't train by themselves in their mom's basements.
Some of them do.
Not the ones in the Olympics right now. They play Madden, right? And that's why they don't have any friends, because they just play online games.
Y'all have been fantastic. Chris, it was great to spend time with you and meet you today. Jonathan, great to spend time with you, and thanks again for setting this up. I learned a lot from it. It's a fascinating topic, and y'all are both doing great things, and I look forward to just kind of watching from the sidelines as the world moves forward. And again, thank you so much for taking time today.
Oh, here's one last thing. You can even edit it out if you want. It's great for your day job because everybody's just ordering stuff online. So it's great for e-commerce, which is great for industrial warehousing in Texas.
It is good for industrial warehousing in Texas. I'm not going to lie on that. That's a different podcast episode, though.
You should be pro remote because you spend more time ordering stuff online.
All right, fellas. Thank you so much again. Hey everyone, it's Chris here again. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, leave a 5-star rating, or write a quick review. Thanks again, and I'll see you on the next episode.
Chris Powers is the founder and CEO of Fort Capital LP. All opinions from Chris and guests of the Fort podcast are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Fort Capital LP. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for real estate or investment decisions. The Fort with Chris Powers is produced by Straight Up Podcasts.